Welcome back, guys. Matt here from the Traveling Together Journal, and today we are working on the floor of the camper, which I'm pretty excited about. It feels like we're actually finally getting some stuff done on the camper itself.
As you remember from previous episodes, we've removed our truck bed and replaced it with a subframe constructed of 1 by 2 inch steel tubing, and built a few small composite panels to test polyurethane pour foam as a core material. Satisfied with my test results, I am ready to scale up to the large composite panel that will be my camper floor.
The first thing we're going to be working on though is the mounts. So I've welded these tabs in place on the subframe. The sheet of plywood will go over the top of that. And then we're going to be using these T-nuts as fasteners. They're going to be inside of the floor. So they'll be sticking down through the plywood. And I'm just always a little bit worried about the wood fatiguing over time with the stress. So we've got 10 of these throughout the subframe. And then I'm also going to be using these large fender washers to help displace the load a little bit more. So the first thing we're going to do to get these ready is I need to drill the holes through these fender washers to match the holes in the T-nuts. With the T-nut mounts all drilled in and dry fit, we're now going to change gears a little bit and work on the internal framing. So we're going to be using the 1 by 2 Douglas fir stripping again and building a little frame that will space the lower sheet of plywood from the upper sheet of plywood, make a gap about 3/4 of an inch thick. And we've had to change our plan on the framing a little bit so that it'll work better with the pour foam insulation since we're not using XPS foam board anymore.
Each piece of the frame is attached to the plywood with exterior grade wood glue and countersunk deck screws. The frame members are attached to each other with wood glue and pocket screws. This is my first time using pocket screws, and I'm liking it so far. The pocket hole jig and bit that I'm using is part of a basic kit that I'll link to in the description box. It made the process really easy. So it was basically glue, screw, and repeat, and the frame came together really nicely. Now I'm ready to turn my attention back to the mounts. With the hardware removed, I saturated the wood in epoxy resin and laid a piece of 6-ounce fiberglass around the hole. Then the hardware was installed with the screws, and the bolt is tightened into the T-nut from underneath to compress the hardware into the wood. Then came another coat of epoxy and fiberglass to seal everything up. This was repeated 10 times, one mount at a time, to ensure that all the mounts stayed aligned with the tabs on the subframe. With that done, I was ready for the top sheet of plywood. This is the same 15/32 inch 5-ply underlayment that I used for the bottom sheet. It is attached using lots of wood glue and clamped in place while I fastened it to the frame with countersunk deck screws. The center part of the floor is now ready to be filled with foam. If we look back at the internal frame, you can see how it separates the space between the plywood skins into 8 separate voids. I tilted the floor up on its side and filled the 4 passenger side voids, then flipped it over and filled the 4 driver side voids. The pour foam is a 2-part polyurethane foam. I measured out each part in separate measuring cups, then poured them into a disposable cup for mixing. The pour foam is still a new material for me to be working with, and dividing the space I was filling into 8 separate sections made me feel a lot more confident that I was completely filling each void. And now we are ready to skin the outboard sections of the floor using the same 15/32 inch plywood that I used for the center portion. To get a stronger joint between the center and outboard sections, I used a router to create a 2-inch wide lap joint in the plywood before attaching it with wood glue and countersunk deck screws. With the last of the plywood attached and the floor back up on its side, I finished filling each of the voids with foam. After trimming the excess foam and getting the floor bolted back onto the subframe, I used a flush trim bit on the router to trim the floor down to the exact size and shape of the subframe. Now, after all that work, I had to cut a chunk out of our new floor. This hole is eventually where our fuel filler hose will be. Now it's time to prep the floor for fiberglass by sanding it down nice and smooth and filling in any holes or cracks with epoxy, and rounding off the edges with a 1/8 inch router bit so that the fiberglass cloth can wrap around the edges. Epoxy and milled glass powder is mixed to create a paste that I use to coat any exposed foam. This was later sanded down to create a smooth, hard surface to glass over. I pre-measured and cut all of my fiberglass, set it aside, and coated the top of the floor and the edges in epoxy resin. Then comes the fiberglass cloth and more resin. I used the same process of resin, fiberglass, and more resin on the outboard sections, along with a little extra effort to get the corners to cooperate, and I was pretty happy with the results. After the resin cured, I sanded down the edges and flipped the floor over to glass the bottom side. It was the same process as the top, but with the added difficulty of working around the mounts. I inserted the mounting bolts covered in masking tape to prevent getting resin into the mounts, then carefully filled any gap around each mount before moving on to the fiberglass. At this point, the floor is completely coated with epoxy resin and 6-ounce fiberglass, with 2 coats on the edges. After sanding down the bottom of the floor with 80 grit sandpaper to rough it up a little bit, it is ready to be attached to the subframe. To prepare the subframe, I scrubbed it down with soap and water and roughed it up a little with the Scotch-Brite pad and wiped it down again. To adhere the floor to the subframe, I used 4 tubes of Sikaflex 252, which is supposed to be able to withstand high dynamic stresses and have good vibration dampening and gap filling characteristics. It is very viscous, so at the recommendation of folks on the internet, I got a pneumatic caulking gun to apply it. The gun is just a cheap one off of Amazon, but it made the job a lot easier, and I was able to get a much more consistent bead than I do with a manual caulking gun. With the floor in place, I tightened down the mounting bolts until the Sikaflex was pressed out of the edges of the subframe, and used clamps to compress the floor on the outboard edges. The goal was to leave 1 to 2 millimeters of Sikaflex between the floor and the subframe. One mistake I made was to try to wipe off the excess Sikaflex. It was much easier to let it dry and cut off the excess with a razor knife. While the Sikaflex cured, I moved on to glassing my wheel wells. All of the small panels that I made in the last video to test pour foam have been screwed together to form the wheel wells. And now I am glassing the inside of each wheel well. After everything cured, I made 4 pocket holes in the sides of the wheel well assemblies and used pocket screws and epoxy paste to attach the wheel wells to the floor. The seams were strengthened with 2 layers of 6-ounce fiberglass tape before coating the top of each wheel well with a layer of 6-ounce fiberglass cloth, thus completing our camper floor. Join me next time as I attempt to build and attach my first wall. And in the meantime, check out the description box of this video for links to tools and products that I used, and feel free to ask questions in the comment section below.